I'm oral historian Mike Chappell. Today, June 15th, 2013, I'm interviewing Dr. Leonard Wartofsky for the Endocrine Society at its annual meeting being held this year at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. Len, please tell me a little bit about your family background.
My family started as immigrants. My father from Poland, who escaped from Poland, was briefly in Antwerp, Belgium, and the family was being rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. He got out, came to the US, met my mother, who was an immigrant from Moldavia, and they married in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And I was born in 1937 in Brooklyn, New York, where he was working as a carpenter. And then the Depression hit, and he went into the grocery business. They had a series of mom and pop grocery stores, feeling that if you had a grocery store, you could always feed your family. That was the rationale, and it seemed to work. So we were always well fed. And he had that store until '68, till the Martin Luther King riots in Washington, when the store was destroyed and sort of a forced retirement. And I have 3 sibs. I was actually the first to graduate college, the first to go to medical school in the family. And that was always a source of great pride to my parents, of course, my son, the doctor. So we had quite a loving relationship in the family.
What type of high school education did you have?
High school was in Washington, D.C., public high school, Theodore Roosevelt High School. That would have been from 52 to 55, graduating in 55 and going directly to college. The Brown decision of the Supreme Court was in 54. So the last year of high school was very interesting because of the appearance of African American students for the first time. And so it was quite a period of transition in Washington, which is indeed south of the Mason-Dixon line and is in many ways a southern city. And the atmosphere being quite different now.
Did any teachers have a particularly strong influence on you?
Yes, I think my biology teacher, who started out single, Miss Slusser, who was actually an attractive woman. I may have had a little crush on her as a high school student, but I worked on some biology projects. She got married. Her name was Mrs. Spiegel, and really, I think, started my interest in the medical field through biology. I was working part-time in a deli and used my hard-earned funds to buy a microscope, set up a little laboratory in the basement. And this was not a toy microscope. This was a full Bausch & Lomb professional high-tech scope that I bought on installments to pay it out, using my older sister's credit to get it. And that's sort of launched my science career, I think.
What about medicine? Was that part of that early science interest?
I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was because of an interest in research. I was doing I got interested in genetics. I was doing Drosophila experiments in the basement, fruit flies.
In high school?
In high school, yeah. I had crossing different types of Drosophila and observing the results until the fruit flies got out, and my mother put the end to my genetics research career at that point.
Why did you choose to attend George Washington University?
I think it was really strictly a matter of economics. We were still struggling in the family economically. In fact, for many of those years, my father had to go back to carpentry to have a steady income and left my mother alone in the grocery store so that he had a regular paycheck, and all of the kids were working. All four of us were working and helping support the family. So GW was in town. I was living at home, so there was no dorm expenses, etc. And at least locally had a good reputation. And I started in pre-med and went right through.
And why zoology for your major?
It seemed like it would either be for medical school, for pre-med, it would either be one of the biological sciences like zoology or one of the chemistry side. And I was more attracted, having worked in biology in high school, I was more attracted to the zoological side.
Did you have a research project?
In college, not until, I think not until a little later, not specifically in college. There were, you know, the usual term papers and so forth, but not a true research project per se.
What about your summer appointments at the section on biochemistry of amino acids at the NIH?
Yes, that was at the NIH. I would work summers at the NIH, I think about 6 or so consecutive summers. And during those summers, certainly I was working on research projects at the NIH, and one of them culminated in my first real publication in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, which was very exciting to get your first paper.
And that was with Simon Black?
Yes.
And could you give me an idea of the ethos of the NIH and what it was like working with Simon Black as at that time in your career?
Sure. It was early, relatively early, and you wouldn't recognize NIH from the NIH of today. There were a number of small brick buildings, usually 3-story buildings. I was in building 4, working in the basement. And now, of course, there are skyscrapers there with new construction, and the budget has gone from, and in that time it might have been a couple of $100 million, and now we're in the billions. So it was quite different. People were very collaborative. There were joint conferences between the institutes. It was a very exciting atmosphere. I remember my first, I think it was my first summer, I was working actually not with Dr. Black, but with Dr. Osamu Hayashi, and on a project, and I found something in a textbook that I thought was contrary to what I was doing, not to get into specifics. And I remember his saying, forget about that. We are writing the textbooks of the future. What you're doing is way ahead of that. That is erroneous information that you're going to correct. And it was an early insight into the importance of research.
Now, upon obtaining your bachelor's degree, how did you envision your career path?
Well, I have to say that in college I fooled around a lot, to be quite candid. The university life kind of went to my head. I was a fraternity boy. I didn't pay as much attention to my studies as I should have, clearly. And then applying for medical school early on in my college career, my grades were not at the level that assured acceptance. And again, because of my financial situation, I was kind of limited to go to either GW or Georgetown to stay in Washington, and did not get accepted to either. Although I think I was on an alternate waiting list at GW that first time. So then steps in my wife-to-be, my then girlfriend, Donna, who said, buckle down and get busy. If you're going to get anywhere, you're going to have to work. And she basically said, stay home, stay home and study. And I did, and from that point on, which is like the last year and a half of college, so that was where the transition was, the first 2.5 years and the last year and a half. So the last year and a half was all straight A's, and but I missed the opportunity to get in after 4. So I actually started a master's program in anatomy, continuing the zoology vein, and then applied for medical school during that year and got accepted. And ultimately continued doing well. My grades in medical school were super, AOA, Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society, and all of that to kind of compensate for those first early years in college. But I freely admit I owed that all to my wife. Otherwise, I think I'd be pumping gas somewhere.
Now, this was George Washington University School
Yes,
of Medicine.
Exactly.
And the reason you chose that, again, was to be close to home? And
Correct.
okay. Were there any features that stand out in particular about your medical school training?
Well, it was the old GW Medical School, which was downtown at 13th and H. And I remember I got married right at the start of medical school, which was a little unusual in those days. There were very few married students. And we lived at 25th in Pennsylvania, so I had the 12-block or so walk right across the White House, and that was from 60 to 64. I have one specific memory, or a couple of specific memories. Of course, 63, the Kennedy assassination, and everyone knows who was alive at that time, knows where they were at that moment, and I was on the wards at GW Hospital, and we all ushered into one of the conference rooms and watched the TV. And also remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and walking past the White House to school and looking up at the sky and wondering when the bombs were going to start falling. So those were very interesting times from that point of view. But the medical education I thought was excellent. I had a very strong, GW was a very strong clinical school, not a heavy research school. So we were well trained as physicians, rotated at the old DC General Hospital, which no longer exists, the city hospital that we shared with Georgetown students and Howard University students. And the clinical pathology, the range of clinical material there was outstanding for education. So I felt I was well trained when I went into internship.
And how did you come to do your internship and assistant residency at Barnes?
Yeah, that was also, I think, one of those forks in the career that, in retrospect, was exceedingly important for my going into academic medicine. I had applied to a number of internships, all at outstanding places, but largely in the Northeast, and went for interviews as far south as Duke, as far north as Boston, to good places, and pretty much depleted my bank account for travel and accommodations for these interviews. And then I got an invitation to interview at Washington University Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. And I wrote back and said, I'm pleased by the invitation, but I'm really sorry I have to decline. Can't afford to come out. And I then got I can't remember whether it was a call or a letter from the chair of medicine, Carl Moore, who said, well, I'm going to be in Washington for a study section, I believe, and if you like, I'd be happy to interview you in my hotel room, which I think was the Roger Smith Hotel at about 18th and Pennsylvania, also no longer there. And I met Dr. Moore, who was internationally known hematologist of great repute. And the interview apparently went well, and I was accepted to WashU. In those days, just as today, one prepared a rank list of where they would like to go. And I had several friends who were trained at Barnes Hospital and raved about it. So I ranked it highly on my list and was selected. And that's how I happened to go there. And Barnes was a very academic place that fostered research. And as part of our internship year, we actually were not just allowed to go to research meetings, encouraged with funding to go to research meetings of the Central Society for Clinical Research, meetings in Chicago or meetings in Carmel. And I think had I not met Dr. Moore, I could see from his point of view, I currently interview internship applicants by the hundreds, and everyone is a pea in a pod. You know, they all have excellent records and excellent letters of recommendation, and what makes somebody stand out. So here I was, the only one he interviewed outside of St. Louis, I presume, to make an impression. And so I think that little quirk of fate got me to that training program and forever influenced my career.
Oh, why did you decide to do your senior residency at Bronx Municipal Hospital?
So I certainly had the opportunity to stay at Barnes for all 3 years of residency, But the third year of residency was very similar to the second year, and I thought it might be nice to experience a different exposure in medicine somewhere. And at that point, I was interested in gastroenterology and hepatology, liver disease. And I did a little investigation and found out that the biggest hotshot in liver disease was a fellow named Irwin Arias, who was at Einstein in the Bronx. So I applied to Einstein for the third year of residency, and also simultaneously applied for a liver fellowship to follow that with a woman named Sheila Sherlock in London, who was internationally known in liver disease, and was accepted to both. Went to Einstein, but Irwin Arias went off on sabbatical that year, and he wasn't there. So I never had the opportunity to either meet or work with him on a project during that year. And as it turned out, I became interested in endocrinology from my endocrine rotations there at Einstein. And then wrote Dr. Sherlock and withdrew from the application for hepatology fellowship, and instead applied for endocrine fellowship.
And that was from your rounds, you said?
Yes, exposure to endocrinology, endocrine patients, and my endocrine faculty.
And then you applied for a fellowship at Harvard.
Yes.
And why did you choose Harvard?
Again, reputation, asking the various faculty, where are the best programs, who would you recommend? And everyone spoke so highly of Sidney Ingbar, who was in the Harvard system at Boston City Hospital, the Thorndike Memorial Laboratory. And they said, well, you can apply there, but I don't think you'll get it. You know, it's a tough program to get into, Harvard and all that stuff. So nothing ventured, nothing gained. Applied and was accepted. And that was the start of my thyroid career.
You mentioned Sidney Ingbar. Would you say a little bit more about him and his stature and his thyroid?
Well, again, world-class, internationally known endocrinologist, thyroidologist, brilliant guy who, I forget some of the details, but he's one of those individuals who graduate high school at 15 and graduate college at 19, and, you know, medical school at 22 or 23. He had a obligatory military service a couple of years at Walter Reed, and then came back to establish this thyroid unit at the Thorndike lab, and just had done some outstanding research that added to his fame. There were really a handful of superb thyroid investigators at that time, and he was really acknowledged as at the top. But a very warm personality, a very supportive personality. He unfortunately smoked and ultimately died of lung cancer. And I remember working at the laboratory bench, and every day Sid would come by at the end of the day and just say, "What's new?" And that "what's new" was the stimulus to produce something. You had to tell him, what did you get done that day? You know, what accomplishment? How close are we to an end in this project? But he would lean over, you'd be working on some data, and he would lean over your shoulder, and the cigarette ash would fall on your data. You know, brush it off. The smoking was was really terrible, you know, in terms of the outcome, because he died at, I think, 62 or 63, quite early, and might have really accomplished so much more.
Now, in terms of your research focus and clinical focus, when you were with Dr. Ingbar, what was it?
It was based on thyroid physiology, thyroid pathophysiology. I worked on understanding Graves' disease, hyperthyroidism, its treatment. We developed, he had an idea to employ a double isotope technique that had been first used by John Nikoloff at USC in Los Angeles in a different approach, and Sid had suggested using it to look at the release of thyroid hormone from hyperthyroid glands and the mechanisms by which you could cut that off. So we did studies on that. I published also with him some greater understanding of the mechanism of what's called iodine leak from the thyroid gland, of how the thyroid either efficiently or inefficiently uses iodine to make thyroid hormone. And we used the double isotope technique to study that as well. And those were my major projects with him during my 2 years at the Thorndike lab, after which I went to Walter Reed and continued to use that technique for a while as well.
Now, I didn't ask you how you got into the thyroid in particular. When you applied for your fellowship, was it based on Sidney Ingbar's reputation or your interest in thyroid? How did that come about?
I think I was a little naive, actually. I thought I was going to an endocrine fellowship that would be endocrinology, but Sid's main interest was thyroid. And there were other people in the division, Ralph Goldsmith, who was interested in calcium and bone disease. But there was a separate fellowship at the Thorndike in diabetes that was run by Ron Arkey and continued to be for many years. And we were separate groups. So many endocrine fellowships, you train in diabetes, because if you go into practice, of course, the bulk of an endocrinologist patients are diabetics. But I had no diabetes. And although in Sid's program I did see adrenal patients and pituitary patients and parathyroid patients, the focus was thyroid, both clinically and research, no diabetes. And I think in, 40, 50 years now, I'm yet to see a diabetic patient and manage to always shunt those patients off to my colleagues. But it was because of Sid's focus on thyroid that I became a thyroidologist as well.
Now, after your time at Harvard, how did you envision your career in medicine and as a clinical investigator?
Well, after Boston, it was to Washington, to Walter Reed, and that was facilitated a lot by Ralph Goldsmith, who I just mentioned, who had been many years at the burn unit in San Antonio in the Army and had some contacts, called someone at the Pentagon and said he had a thyroid guy. And there was a thyroid guy who was then leaving Walter Reed, Paul Rosenfeld, who was leaving. I think he went to Wisconsin. So they needed a thyroid person. And I went to Walter Reed ostensibly with an obligation for 3 years to get that cush assignment. But they neglected to get me to sign any obligation piece of paper, so I was really eligible to leave after 2 years. but the environment there was so fertile for research, unlimited research funds, fantastic clinical material. I've often said I saw more thyroid disease at Walter Reed my first month than I did 2 years in Boston, because the referrals were from all over the world to Walter Reed. And I was the thyroid guy, so I saw them all. And ended up staying there, signing on 1 year at a time at Walter Reed. After a year and a half, I started looking for jobs, and my bosses said, "Oh, you can't leave. You have a 3-year obligation. You signed the paper." And I said, "Show me the paper. I never signed it." But after looking around, I realized I had the best job. There was nothing out there better than I already had because of the funding and ability to do both excellent clinical work and research. So I said, okay, I'll sign the paper. And I signed it and stayed for a 3rd year, and then stayed for 1 year, until before I knew it, I had stayed at Walter Reed for 25 years and then got out.
I guess I want to ask you 2 follow-ups on that. First one is this was during the Vietnam era.
Yes.
So that was part of your motivation.
Yes, very definitely.
Okay.
I'm a patriot, but I'd rather be a patriot at Walter Reed than Vietnam.
And that's why you refer to this as a cushy job.
Cushy, yes. Cushy because it wasn't Vietnam. Not cushy because it wasn't hard work. It was hard work.
And then, let's see, what led you to do your contracts a year at a time? What was the advantage of that, rather than feeling like a long-term contract where you know you'd be there? Yeah.
Well, I think the downside of not having a long-term contract is that you became what was called regular Army, and you were eligible for more benefits. But the downside of signing is that now your body belonged to the Army, and they could reassign you. And there was nowhere I wanted to be other than Walter Reed. So by only having the 1 year obligation, it didn't pay for them to reassign me anywhere. And I was certain to stay at Walter Reed.
Would you describe your rise through the ranks to chief of, I guess, the Department of Medicine, and also the process of building up that department?
It was a small department. Actually, when I started, it was a combination of the Renal Division and the Metabolic Division. It was called Renal Metabolic. And when I got there, we split it, and nephrology went their way, and we created the Endocrine Division. And we began to grow. A new chief was brought in, a gentleman named Jerry Earl, who is still here in Washington, retired, of course. And he was able to recruit more staff to grow the division. He asked me to be the assistant chief of the division, which I became. And it became, I use the word a fertile environment. I don't know how better to explain that we did have access to a metabolic ward to do clinical studies. We had funding. We had laboratories, and between Dr. Earl and myself, we continued to justify to the Army the importance of research and get resources to do it. So over those years, we were able to increase resources and increase staff, faculty, ultimately, when I started, and it was really 2 endocrinologists, and when I turned over the department and I moved up to be chair of medicine, I left a division with 13 or 14 endocrinologists, an active fellowship training program, a research unit metabolic ward with a dozen nurses, the laboratory probably 6 or 8 technicians, 2 PhDs, and we were publishing between 30 and 40 papers a year coming out of that unit. It was called the Kyle Metabolic Unit. It was named after Lawrence Kyle, who was an endocrinologist at Georgetown, who was a consultant to our unit, used to visit once a month and see patients, do rounds, teaching rounds. So the unit was named after Larry Kyle, but it was built up under Jerry Earle and myself. Jerry moved up to be chair of medicine. I became the chief of the endocrine unit, I think in about 76. And then I moved up to be chair of medicine in the mid-'80s sometime. It blurs mid to late 80s, I think. So I ran the endocrine unit for probably over a dozen years of that time.
Could you give me just an idea of what your day was like as, say, chair?
In the endocrine division?
Yeah.
It was a nice mix between a couple of days in clinic seeing patients and teaching, between the fellowship, and we were also affiliated with Georgetown, so we had Georgetown students and Georgetown residents rotating with us. In addition, in 1976, the military medical school was started, the first graduating class in 1980. That's the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda. And there was no building on Jones Bridge Road where the medical school is in 76. So we actually started the school at Walter Reed. And my endocrine division taught endocrine physiology to the first year medical students. There was no department of physiology yet. You just start a medical school, but there was no faculty, no building, nothing, just the money to do it. So, but it grew quickly after that. So a lot of teaching obligation. And then research. I was doing studies on our metabolic unit. We had the opportunity to admit patients with various diseases and keep them for weeks, sometimes longer, doing various provocative tests and studies, and that's largely where a lot of the publications came from.
Do you want to say more about your experience at Walter Reed, or can I ask you why you left Walter Reed?
Well, the usual tenure in the military is 20 years, that one is eligible to retire with a pension at 20 years. And as you stay longer, your pension opportunity increases slightly by a couple of % per year. But it's financially not particularly wise to stay because you're losing your pension. So at 20 years, you continue on your salary, but you're missing your pension payment, which you would get if you got out. So it's not financially wise, and the military doesn't really appreciate the gray hair of having senior people there with experience to do teaching. So you're almost encouraged to leave by this financial situation. But I was continuing to have a good time and be productive and enjoy it, and looked around casually at other positions, but again, there was nothing truly better than what I had, so I stayed 21, 22, 23. Finally, the last year I was tempted to leave to my current position because it was still in Washington, and my wife didn't want to leave Washington, born in DC, raised in DC, her relatives, mine in DC. So I was then chief of medicine, chair of medicine at Walter Reed, and the opportunity came up for the same job downtown at Washington Hospital Center to build a department of medicine. And it was attractive. The person recruiting me, Jim Howard, had joined the Army with me back in '69. We both came in at the same time. He came in maybe 6 months later. So I knew him, trusted him, we were friends, and he would be my boss and offered the kind of support to build a department that he stuck to. And it was turned out to be another great opportunity. So that's why I left, and shortly after I left, I recruited Ken Berman, who was my first fellow in endocrinology at Walter Reed, and who he himself grew up to be chief of the Endocrine Division. And I recruited him to come to the hospital center to be my chief of endocrine there in the division. So we've had a partnership in research going back to probably 1970. Long-standing partnership.
And what have been your major challenges or accomplishments at the Washington Hospital Center?
Well, the challenges were to build a department. When I came, there were about 15 full-time faculty in the Department of Medicine, a rather small department, but an administration that was interested in becoming a major player. And the support was there, and today there are about 110 full-time members of the Department of Medicine. I recruited a lot of young, energetic people with academic interests in all the divisions, not just endocrine, in all the divisions of medicine. And we are, I think, Washington Hospital Center has been the only hospital in the district recognized by U.S. News and World Report for, I think, the last 10 years until this year. I think Georgetown got recognized in gynecology for the first time, but we had merged our programs with Georgetown. And this year, Fairfax Hospital was recognized also. But we have been the only one recognized, and endocrinology has been the specialty that is recognized every year. So we're proud of that. The administration has been very supportive of the growth. So it's been an excellent ride there as well as it has been at Walter Reed. I've been very fortunate.
Did you know that that's the opportunity you were getting into when you made the change from Walter Reed? And did you have a second choice, or was it either switch to the Washington Hospital Center or stay at Walter Reed?
I didn't know. You never know what's going to happen, of course. But I trusted Jim Howard, as I mentioned, and indeed he did come through because he came from an academic background as well. His wife, Barbara Howard, was the president of our research institute, and she was very supportive to bring young investigators and raise the academic milieu at Washington Hospital Center. So I thought, well, I'll give it a try for a few years. If they don't come through, I'll move to somewhere else. But they did come through, and it's been a superb experience. There could have been other options, yes. I was looking at other positions, typically chair of medicine positions at other institutions. But in retrospect, I even looked at a position in industry as an option that would have been more lucrative, but it all worked out very well.
Now, could you tell me how you divide your day? I know it's a busy day.
Well, currently I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. So that is, I think, about a third FTE requirement. And if I can't steal any time during my day at the hospital to work on the JCEM, then I do at night. So my day can be quite long. It's not the 8 hours at the hospital. It's generally 11 or 12 at the hospital, and then the JCEM for a couple of hours additional at night. But remarkably, my day at Washington Hospital Center is not dissimilar from what it was at Walter Reed. So it's a couple of days of clinic, seeing patients, and my focus now is thyroid cancer. I try to see only complicated thyroid cancer patients, generally referred by other endocrinologists who feel they have less expertise with thyroid cancer. And we've developed a multidisciplinary thyroid cancer center at the Washington Hospital Center. So excellent thyroid surgeons, nuclear medicine, pathology, radiology, the works. So we are referred a lot of patients. And because I've developed a reputation, I get a lot of those referrals from all over the country and several from other parts outside of the US. So my day, a couple of days seeing thyroid cancer patients, administration of a department of 110 faculty, 100 residents in medicine, another 50 fellows in the subspecialties, various committee meetings related to hospital activities, and teaching rounds and so forth. It's quite easy to fill the day. Again, a mix of I've always found variety to be the spice of life. I've never liked to just see patients. That's why I didn't go into practice. To do that 5 days a week, I would find a little stultifying, I think. But a couple of days a week, I love my patients and enjoy the interaction. But I still like to turn to research and enjoy aspects of administration to be able to build a legacy for the future, and then teaching. So all four legs of the tripod are important.
Before I ask you a little bit about your research, a little bit more about your research, how big are your responsibilities? How many divisions or departments do you have to deal with? And could you just say a little bit more about that aspect of your administration?
Well, there are about 11 or 12 divisions, so every subspecialty in medicine: kidney disease, nephrology, cardiology, rheumatology, infectious disease, geriatrics, endocrinology, pulmonary disease. We have a large hospitalist service, some 25 physicians on the hospitalist service. Those are hospital-based doctors, fall within my department. And then all the staff associated with each of those divisions. Every division has its own training program, fellowship. So I'm ultimately responsible. I have 3 sub-chiefs, an associate chair for administration, an associate chair for research, and an associate chair for education. But ultimately it all bubbles up to me. So it keeps one active and busy.
Now, in regards to basic research and clinical research, would you say you have had an overarching goal?
Overarching, I'd put it more general. I'd say not a specific overarching goal, but more general to gain better understanding of mechanisms of endocrine disease, but thyroid disease specifically, and treatment of thyroid disease. So my research has been largely clinical investigation. I did do basic work when I was a fellow with Sitting Bar, and actually a lot of that was never published. I have reams of notebooks of rat data that we did. I guess some of it was published, yes, some of it was published, but I don't see it as major contributions. The more important things were clinicals, the Graves' disease studies that I mentioned. When I first went to Walter Reed, there was an environment that you needed to do something that we called mission related, that had some relevance to the Army, or why are you here? Why are you doing research? So I would do my general thyroid research, but then I would also do something mission related. And I started doing the mission related work on infectious disease and what is the impact of infectious disease on the endocrine system. So I did studies using malaria as a model. How did malaria perturb the endocrine system, specifically thyroid economy? And that led to an interest in the euthyroid 6 syndrome, because infected patients are sick, and that's a model for the so-called euthyroid 6 syndrome. So out of those studies, we did several other studies looking at mechanisms of the euthyroid 6 syndrome. And it becomes one thing leading to another, that you would be looking at what's happening at the thyroid level and then get an insight into, well, what's happening at the pituitary level. And then we'd start looking at TSH and how is that affected by infection or systemic illness. And that led to one of my collaborators at that time, Gordon Knoll, who was also in the unit, was interested in prolactin, another pituitary hormone. So then that opened another door. How do some of these studies affect prolactin physiology and people, women who have tumors producing prolactinomas. So it's kind of going where one's interest led as doors were opened and questions came up. So overarching not, but lots of different directions. A lot of interest in autoimmune thyroid disease, Graves' disease, Hashimoto's studies there. Some in collaboration with other people. And then ultimately to thyroid neoplasia, tumors of the thyroid, nodules, and cancer. And that led me for the last 10 years or so to focus on thyroid cancer.
Now, what in particular interested you about thyroid cancer? What door opened for you?
Well, I actually went to Barnes Hospital, an internship, thinking I would be an oncologist. And that was, you asked me why St. Louis, why WashU and Barnes Hospital, and I neglected to mention that another factor there was that it was a real powerhouse in hematology oncology. Carl Moore, the chair, was internationally known on the ward service. There were two services. There were a ward service and a private service for house staff. And the chief of the private service, Dr. Ed Reinhardt, also a hematologist. And these two big giants got referred patients from all over and built divisions of hem-onc that were quite strong. So I thought of the choices of places I had to go, St. Louis would be good because I would be an oncologist. Well, I got a little depressed, not clinically, but emotionally, managing oncology patients. Had a number of young patients with fatal diseases, and I decided this was not for me. I emotionally could not take oncology. And then I switched to liver, as I told you earlier. Well, here I am, 40 years later, doing oncology again, but this time thyroid cancer. I think it's not a matter of, I have a number of trainees now who are going into oncology because their mother had breast cancer or a father colon cancer, and there's nothing quite like that. I think I just think of cancer as one of those scourges that whatever we can do to find out to reduce the impact of that disease, to understand it better and affect people's lives is a laudable goal. And so there's sort of an inherent interest of puzzle solving and doing better than we are now. And it offers challenges. So, and it's inherently interesting from an intellectual point of view.
So the emotional impact on you now that you have more experience, you feel, and the challenges also that are interesting to you, they've changed your willingness to look at cancer?
Yes, I think they have. I think they have. Maybe I've matured a little. I can take the heat in the kitchen a little better, and just more involvement with my patients.
What was the standard treatments for thyroid cancer when you started your latest examination in oncology?
Yeah, I think you're alluding to the evolution in treatment for thyroid cancer that I can recall in the early days at Walter Reed. Basically, in retrospect, we didn't really know what we were doing. The treatment was surgical, and we knew that thyroid cancer could take up radioactive iodine as a function of thyroid cells that take up iodine. So the treatment was surgery and relatively high dose radioiodine. And in those early days, we didn't fully appreciate the side effects of radioiodine, and we did damage to patients. And often the surgery was either overly aggressive or inadequate, because that was not well understood. And When the tumors did not take up radioiodine, we had really no other option other than perhaps external beam radiation. So it was a rather short management, a list of management options. And there's been just so much, really an explosion of research in the last 15 years that has led to greater understanding of thyroid cancer, that has enabled the surgery is better, is more selective. There's large-scale studies of what should be done or what should not be done surgically. For the radioactive applications, we're now moving more away from radioactive iodine in many cases and reserving it for special selected patients. And we have other therapies, new chemotherapies that were not available. Years ago, in the early days, the only thing available, chemotherapy, were the standard chemotherapies for other cancers that are very, very toxic. And now we have targeted molecular therapies that are designed specifically for a genetic mutation within the tumor. And we still have a long way to go, but just multiple other approaches, interventional local approaches like radiofrequency ablation or ethanol injection, just a whole host of studies. The development of recombinant human TSH for diagnosis and treatment. It's been a remarkable 10 years, and I think now we're entering a phase of even more accelerated development of information that I recall when I told Dr. Carl Moore that I had decided not to do oncology and do liver, and why, because I was disheartened by the cancer patients. He said, I'm certain that we'll have a cure for leukemia in 10 years. And we didn't, and he died a little bit after that 10-year interval. And that recollection just went through my mind because I was about to say, I think we'll have some real cures for thyroid cancer in 10 years. So I caught myself thinking about Dr. Moore. So these are exciting times in thyroid cancer. I think the pace of discovery being accelerated so much that we're going to make remarkable advances, particularly at the molecular level. And there are several outstanding laboratories in this country and abroad that are making contributions. And I think I wish that could be true for all cancers, but thyroid cancer, I think, is going to be conquered in the not too distant future. I won't say 5 years or 10 years, but.
I'd like to ask you about the American Thyroid Association.
Yes.
You administered the ATA as its secretary. You played a key role in the founding of its journal and served as its president in 1995. How did you get involved with the governance of the American Thyroid Association?
I was a member early on, again, Sitting Bar being my role model and mentor, was very active in the ATA. And I think it may have been the first organization I joined, certainly before the Endocrine Society. It would have been probably a year after I finished fellowship. And I immediately took to the society. It's a very collegial group. It's small compared to the Endocrine Society. At that time, it was about 400 or 500 members. and there were no simultaneous sessions, just one session at the annual meeting, and you sat there, whether it was on molecular aspects or clinical aspects. Both the PhDs and the practitioners sat through and you were expected to be at the meeting, and very collegial group, so an enjoyable association. And after some committee work, maybe a committee chair, I was at Walter Reed and got a call from the then secretary, Colum Gorman, who was at the Mayo Clinic, saying the nominating committee had met and they would like to ask me if I would be willing to serve as secretary. And I was kind of floored, because I had been a young squirt in this society, and the people who had been secretary had been big shots in thyroidology. And I said, Colum, I'm really flattered, but I think I'm too young to take this on. And he said, well, Len, how old are you? And I told him, I can't calculate right now how old I was at that time. I told him how old he was. He says, oh, really? He says, well, you're older than I was when I took this on. I said, really? Okay. So I said, yes, I would. And it was a 5-year term. The secretary of the organization really runs the organization totally, with one office helper, like the old days of the Endocrine Society. And in fact, Colum Gorman had a half-time person helping him. And when the office moved to Walter Reed, I was able to move it up to a full-time person. And Walter Reed, because of the honor of having the ATA there, gave me an office, gave me space for the ATA, and it was the official ATA office was at Walter Reed. The presidency is a 1-year position, and the president's, it's almost honorary. They run all the board meetings and so forth, but all the day-to-day management is by the secretary. So I think that got me really involved in association dynamics and politics. That was good training for coming into similar activities in the Endocrine Society, and also got to meet lots of colleagues. And every 4 years is an international meeting between the 4 thyroid associations, the European, the South American, and the Asian. So you get to meet your counterparts at the other countries and develop international friendships, collaborations. So it was quite rewarding being the secretary during those years, and then subsequently was elected to be president for 1 year. I think a year or two later, after giving up the secretaryship. But I've always had a very fond place in my heart for the ATA, my first association. It's now grown. I think it may be about 1,200 members, and they now do have simultaneous sessions at the annual meeting, but it's still a rather small group compared to the Endocrine Society.
What was the Endocrine Society like when you first joined it?
Now, it was quite small. There was, this morning, a slide was shown by Bill Young related to Scott Hunt's retirement, showing the society, I think in '88. Is that when Scott started?
Yeah. So, yeah.
From '88, and said there were 5,400 members, and now there's 16,000, and there were 4 employees. Well, '88, I remember when I think it was 1 employee. And I joined the Endocrine Society, I believe, in '72, and it was Nettie Carpin, and the office was right up Rockville Pike in the FASAB area. They shared space with FASAB, and I was on the program committee. I remember we had a meeting of the program committee there where we just sat around the table and kibitzed about what we should have on the program. It was very loose, very informal compared to the program committee today of 35, 40 people fashioning this extremely complicated multi-session meeting that we have. It was quite simple. I remember being called to the office to count votes at an election for president of the society. And they were paper votes that had been mailed in, and just going through and sorting them out. It was, I refer to my family's grocery store as a mom and pop operation. I think the Endocrine Society was a mom operation. It was only Nettie, and Nettie turned it over to Scott, who Scott has told me informally that he was tempted to quit. I don't know if he's mentioned that to you in your interview with him, but that the society was in such disarray his first year. He was wondering what he had gotten into and whether he would really stick it out or not. But
Were you aware of that?
I was not. I would say not at all.
But were you aware of that there was a transition going on that was going to...
Yes, yeah, definitely that there was a transition going on, and that we were really entering a growth phase very early on in Scott's tenure, but not of any real difficulties or problems that didn't leak out.
Now, you were elected president of the Endocrine Society, and
Yes.
I'm wondering, I know that the society is referred to as having three constituencies, and did your election represent more than one or more of these constituencies?
So the three constituencies are basic scientists, our clinical scientists, and physicians in practice. And with the strategic plan some 10, 12 years ago, we implemented a rotating system where there would be representatives of the constituencies on council, and that every third year would be the other constituency. So they were in rotation. The Endocrine Society's history has been very rich in basic scientists, basic research, and clinical investigation. And there was a big rift, and I can't remember the year, but probably in the 80s, that a group of clinicians split away from the Endocrine Society and formed ACE, the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists. And the complaint was that the society did not provide enough respect, support for physicians in practice. So we were going to split off and start our own society. And I think that was a big wake-up call for the Endocrine Society to realize that that was actually true. And the powers that were in place at that time were basic scientists and clinical investigators who just perpetuated that feeling that that was best. The more academic approach to endocrinology. This is good medicine for you, and you have to take it, even though you're a physician in practice. We'll tell you what's best for you. It was a little arrogant. So when the clinicians split off, I think Scott had a major awakening that something needed to be done. And more and more programs began to be developed for clinicians. And then this strategic plan that I just alluded to that would actually put in place a role for a physician in practice. So every 3 years, then, a physician in practice was to be elected president. So this is very early in this rotation, and by history, there weren't any physicians in practice really in the hierarchy of the organization, because it had been all these other guys, these other two constituencies. So when it came time to nominate folks, it was a rather short list, because the requirements to be president meant that you had to have been very involved in the society, to have been on committees, to have been a committee chair, and to have been on council. How could you be a president and understand the workings of the society if you had not been on council? So there were few of these characters. And the year I was nominated to run for president, I ran against Bill Young, who is president today. Bill is at the Mayo Clinic, which is a prestigious institution. And is he a physician in practice or a clinical investigator? He's sort of a hybrid. He publishes, he teaches, he's at an academic institution, but he's very proud of being a practitioner and seeing patients too. And I was at the hospital center, and as I mentioned, I see patients 2 days a week. But if you asked anyone who knows me, which constituency is Wartofsky in, they would probably say he's a clinical investigator. And I think that designation fits me, although I may spend more time in administration as a department chair, but that's not one of the categories. So I think it was maybe squeezing a square peg into a round hole that put me in as a nominee for president as a physician in practice. And I remember when that announcement came out that Bill and I were running for president, several people coming up to me and saying, "You're a physician in practice? Come on." But it was just sort of necessary at the time, because the list of not capable, but of qualified people having had committee experience and council experience was very short. Now, because we have been fostering more physicians in practice to be involved, there's no shortage. And I think each election since has clearly put a real physician in practice in the rotation. And Bill Young is back and has done a great job this year as president.
What would you say as president, which of your accomplishments as president would you say were the most significant?
It was a busy year. I think I started quite a number of initiatives, but the one that really stands out in my mind, and I was reminded of it just this morning, is starting the Fellows Day or Trainees Day, which occurred yesterday. Because this morning they showed a photo of the 200 and some trainees lined up on the stairs who attended that meeting yesterday. So this is a meeting, an all-day educational event directed to both clinical fellows and also research fellows, to try to not only offer them a wonderful menu of lectures and workshops during the day, but to also have a focus of getting them more involved in the Endocrine Society. That I think we have, my concern in my president year was that we were losing fellows to ACE, our sister organization, because ACE puts on something called the Endocrine University every year at the Mayo Clinic, where fellows are invited for some 3 or 4 days of lectures and workshops and ultrasound and things like that. Really wonderful idea that they did. And we had nothing similar. And I remember talking to my fellows in endocrinology and saying, "Are you a member of the Endocrine Society?" And no, and they're wearing an ACE pin. And I said, "Why not both organizations?" Well, you know, they just mumbled, no real reason. And the ACE was because of the Endocrine University. So I thought if we started something like that, at least one day, bring the fellows, get them involved in the society, and they love it. The reviews on that day by the fellows are, Maggie Werman was sitting next to me this morning, and she said one of her fellows was so excited and said she heard the best lecture she'd ever heard in her life yesterday on the Fellows Day, and it was by Gary Hammer. And she is so motivated for endocrinology now and so excited from that one lecture. And Maggie leaned over to me and said, "And you started that." Mm-hmm. So it was, it's very gratifying. Of course, I didn't start it myself. I started it with the support of the Endocrine Society. The council bought it and they approved it and voted for it, and we had the funds. So the society has supported it and made it a big success. And that's probably the one thing that I remember most clearly and am most proud of.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the plight of the clinical investigator. About 15 years ago, Joseph Goldstein and Michael Brown had an article, "The Clinical Investigator, Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, but Still Beloved," and they spoke about that plight. I'm wondering, is that still the state for the clinical investigator?
I'd say it's even worse today than 15 years ago, and I think there have been commentaries written since that article about the unfortunate plight of the clinical investigator. And it really is related to a whole series of issues with a fiscal undertone. And it starts back in medical school. So medical students now are graduating with sizable loans. They also have a different lifestyle expectation.